moderating this great group. Kathleen Abernathy, sitting here to my left, is a former chair at the FCC. Been here over. Did I say chair?
Yeah.
She never was chair.
Yeah.
Would have been a great idea, though.
But I'm going to put it on my resume.
Okay, in the alternative reality, where she was a former chair, she was amazing as the chair. Reality, she was only a commissioner, and she was excellent in that role. She also has lots of ties to Colorado, way back when U.S. West Wireless, do I remember that?
Correct.
Among other positions. She's now at Frontier as executive vice president.
Of external affairs.
External affairs.
Yes.
And we're thrilled to have her. Mark Jameson, who has been a long-time academic and real thought leader in this space, recently served on the Trump transition team and has done a lot of work international as well, so brings a lot to the conversation. Erin McGrath worked previously for Commissioner Robert McDowell, now Commissioner O'Reilly at the FCC, where she focused on wireless, among other matters. And finally, Brian Tramont, who is really an unbelievable supporter of Silicon Flatirons and friend. People have commented on how our students are so fortunate, and that good fortune is greatly due to the level that Brian goes to bat for our students, and he's amazing in that. He comes, teaches every spring, and the students who go to DC in the summer are the beneficiaries of his hospitality. So thank you for being such an amazing supporter. It's great to have you here. I'm going to call an audible with Bill Kavasik getting the tip off here. I did warn this panel they might have to hear me advert to the paper that was already advertised. And I think Bill's point is such a powerful one, which is we want government to be innovative. We want to see entrepreneurial leader in government, but we may not accept failure. That's a tough equation to get your arms around. So Mark, one of the great experiences that transitions allow is a space between academia and governing. And I don't know if this was a particular theme that you thought through during that time, but I'll let you take a first shot at this. How do we wrestle with this challenge of really we're asking our governmental leaders to be more innovative, particularly in these technological areas like drones that we just mentioned, but yet we're so wary of failure?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. And for that particular question, actually, I'll draw more on my international experience than on the transition team experience, because with the transition team, everything is not public. So I can't speak for anything that I did during that time, but anyone else did during that time as well. I think it's, in some sense, it's a balance, but it's more kind of in economics we call it constrained optimization, which means that you have laws that you're not to push outside of. Because especially in the case of infrastructure, if regulation pushes outside the laws, then people don't know how to make business plans, and investment declines. And I think we've certainly seen that all over the world. We've seen that in this country as well. So the question is, how do you do things well within those boundaries? And I think the key there is to make sure that you have very good analyses and very knowledgeable people in the staff, and they have to be able to do their work. And that's one of the things that I've talked about before the election, talked about since the election as well, and that is that the commission, with its political pressures, has to be able to protect the analyses of the staff. You have to have very well qualified people, good economists, good engineers that are free to give you the economically correct answers, the engineering correct answers, and then you make your decision. I think that's really the key, is to get many good facts, as many good analyses as you can, and then decide what you do within the boundaries of the laws.
So Kathleen, I'm going to big up and sharpen the question for you. One of the challenges when those analyses give you a suggestion we should try something new, you get this tough situation, because if you stick with what you had been doing and it doesn't work, then it's explainable. But if you try something new and it doesn't work, then you get the problem I mentioned. So how do you square that challenge?
You know, I think it's a huge challenge, not just in government, but in the private sector. It's incredibly difficult in large organizations to bubble up innovative ideas. Even if you want to, even if you tell people, give me your ideas, the reality is that getting them through the layers up to the senior leaders, whether it's the senior leaders in an agency or the senior leaders in a company, everyone wants to be innovative. It's much easier in a startup because you don't have the bureaucracy. So how do you work around it? What I've seen sometimes works is that you will have a particular working group where you take some individuals and you say, pull together a proposal, make it innovative, and bring it to us. And at least then you get the information. But then what do you do with the information? Most of the time, I wish this wasn't true, most of the time people look at it and say, well, I didn't mean you to be that innovative. What was I thinking? What were you thinking? And it's risk. Yeah. And people don't take risks easily. So I don't have a great answer other than I think you have to continually, as a leader, whether it's the leader of an agency or the leader of a company, you have to constantly question, am I getting the best, most innovative thinking, and how much risk am I willing to take? And am I willing to allow failure? And all the time, whether it's been in government or in the private sector, I've done things with 80-20. Maybe I had 80% of the information, and you take leaps of faith, and you're terrified when you're taking those leaps of faith because it can go either way. But you do have to occasionally let someone fail and publicly show that that's okay, so that others within the company or the government agency will go ahead and continue to innovate.
So, Brian, you were Chief of Staff to Chairman Michael Powell. It was adverted earlier, he came here and gave a speech around internet freedom. He also came here and gave a speech announcing a wireless initiative that involved the sort of task force that you just referred to, with the goal of really trying to bring some new thinking into wireless policy. Any reflections on this broad theme, or particularly in wireless, Brian? How do we get some new thinking and new directions?
So I guess a couple things. First, and Mark alluded to it before, elections do present opportunities, and change presents opportunities, excuse me. And change presents opportunities. So I think this is a great time to have this conversation, and I think maybe more than any presidency ever, this is about breaking glass, right? And there is more willingness to look outside traditional models in order to find things that might work. And I do think that issues like this are a place where you can, where Ajit and Maureen and other folks in leadership positions will have an opportunity to do more experimentation. I do think that the Spectrum Task Force worked. We also did something called FCC Best. I saw Anna Gomez earlier, who I believe headed the innovation task force or component of FCC Best, which was designed to bring innovative ideas about how to govern up to the chairman's office so we could implement change, and did working groups across the agency. I think anytime you bring cross-disciplinary teams together so that you break apart the traditional personnel silos, that's a positive thing. One of the things in preparing for today, I looked at the paper that I guess Brad Rivera wrote, and he had some co-author. I don't remember who that was, and something about the
random guy,
the Government Entrepreneurial Leadership Accelerator we talked about earlier. And I think that's where the Joy's Law quote was in that article, about that no matter who you are, most of the smartest people work for someone else. And I think there is something to be said for that, and it's important that the leadership, whether it's at the agency or at a company, as Kathleen alluded to before, recognizes that there are boundaries around the intelligence and exposure of the people who are in any organization, and you have to be comfortable enough to reach outside of it. And hopefully the new leadership that is taking place across these agencies is going to be prepared to reach out and do things outside of the traditional government structures and tap those different ideas. I think Kathleen's right, though. You have to have leaders who are comfortable embracing folks who risk and fail. And it's hard to do in government, particularly because of the political components of this. But I think we're at a real inflection point, a real area of opportunity now. And the paper had one other interesting point, which is said political campaigns are all about that.
Right.
Political campaigns take risk all the time and are constantly trying to break traditional paradigms, as this campaign did. And for some reason, political leaders, once they get into office, seem to lose that ability. And some of it's the type of people they recruit, but a lot of it's the institutional structure. And bringing more, in some weird way, bringing some of that sensibility from a management perspective to solving the public's problems, I think would be very powerful.
I would have to agree with everything everybody said, which I don't think is going to come as a shocker, but whenever you deal with innovation at the FCC, which I will, base all of my comments on, you always hit a certain level of conflict, which everybody has sort of touched on. Whenever you try to do something that is new or different or out of the box, especially in the context of spectrum management, there's always going to be two sides. So to the extent that people don't think that the FCC is innovative, a lot of people try to make it as innovative as possible. But the second that that decision starts to float upwards to the 8th floor of the actual decision makers, that is the second where suddenly you have the wireless industry versus the satellite industry, or you have various different components who are going to stand there and go like, oh, wait a second, we like innovative thinking, but we want that innovative thinking to help us. And sometimes you have that sharing aspect where suddenly, that innovative thinking is held up by the fact that you have to take sides. And I think that the FCC deals with that quite consistently. And by looking at all of the issues and all of the facts, and as you mentioned, FCC has to make data-driven decisions. And my boss is always saying, they're going, give me the data. What can we do? I understand that everybody wants a chunk of this spectrum. How can we get everybody to fit into a small band? That is how the best policy is made. Sometimes it's slow, and sometimes it's not perfect, and oftentimes it is ugly. But you have to do the best with what you have.
And I'd add one point, which is, as a country, we should not rely on government agencies for innovation in technology. That would be a very bad thing for all of us, because the technological innovation comes from the private sector, and then regulators try to figure out how is the market working, when is the market working, and when are certain public policy objectives not being met. So the beauty of just to end on a higher note, because I'm always very negative about getting things done in big companies or in the government. The beauty of this approach, though, is that we have companies figure this stuff out. And then they do come to the regulators and say, I want my fair regulatory advantage. And then they have to duke it out between them, and it's up to the agency to manage that process. But we have, look at all the startups. We have tremendous innovation going on, and I really think you don't want a government trying to curtail, manage, frame that innovation. You want them afterwards looking at it and saying, how do I take this chaos and this excitement and figure out what the public policy goals are?
Can I go back in this? Okay. So
Yeah, are you going to disagree?
no, I'm going to
All right,
completely
then we
agree.
can talk.
We all completely agree with you.
Don't worry. Don't worry. I still
A very happy panel.
once worked with you, always work for you.
Once a staffer, always a
Exactly.
staffer.
No, what I think of the distinction to draw, I think it's true that you don't ever want to look to the government for technological innovation, but looking at them for policy innovation is a reasonable thing. And on spectrum in particular, the American track record's pretty good. Whether it's this incentive auction, which came from within the agency, mind you,
Right.
as a concept, and was through execution at the legislative level, and then ultimately to the auction that's now wrapping up. That's a remarkable evolution and true intellectual leadership on something that's very hard. The original auctions are another example. Maybe a harm claim threshold will be another example. But there's, I had to do that for you guys, yeah. But there are, in the spectrum space in particular, I think there is a wealth of innovative leadership that's already been implemented in the U.S. I actually think the failure is something that I think Chairman Kovacic mentioned earlier that I would like to spend more time on is we don't study enough the things that work and didn't and why. Mm-hmm. So whether it's, where's Kathleen Ham? We tried something else. Where is she? Guard band managers. Well, anyway, that was one example. Okay, I know that one didn't work, but it was something we tried.
But it seemed like a good innovation.
And it didn't work. MVDDS probably didn't work. Why? Maybe we should have tried something different. The original 3650 to 3700 contention-based protocol didn't really work.
Unlicensed PCS.
The original WCS.
Right.
Yeah,
So there we go. We got the examples. But we need to figure out when the government innovates, when it doesn't work, why does it not work? And learning from that, it would be really valuable. And I think that might be the area in which we fall down as innovators on the policy side, is not looking enough at failures, because it's not a very popular thing to do.
Students looking for good paper topics, come talk to Brian about this one. He'll happily chat with you about it.
Where the commission has been most successful is where it puts the resource out there and lets industry innovate with it. And so probably when you get right down to it, the most innovative thing the commission ever did was flexible use.
Yeah.
So when we switched to taking away the silos of you have to use X for Y, and you can't use it for anything else, and we broke that barrier, a lot of great things came from it. So you have to figure that the FCC is fairly good at using innovative policy making and trying to promote innovation. It doesn't mean we get it right every time, but you know,
Wi-Fi is another example. Wi-Fi is a great example of where we just put this resource out and
Put
the
it out
innovation could, no longer the land of baby monitors. So.
And then also looking outside the U.S. for some lessons as well. Some of the things that we're now starting to do on subsidies for universal service have been done 20 years ago outside the U.S. and we're trying to look at those and trying to incorporate them into it. And then, how does the industry? How does the regulator view itself? The FCC is still in silos. How it's structured. You look around the world, that's not so true in a lot of other places.
So as we talk about experiments and collecting data, one of the weaknesses of the FCC is does it have enough technological talent to actually get the data on issues. I'll stick with spectrum. Recent issues, LTE, Wi-Fi dispute, the Global Star matter, there was a big question about whether the FCC in its own agency had access to technical information. So this issue might be in drones. I don't know it as well. Jennifer can refer later. Does the FAA have the right engineers who can take all the innovations that are happening in the private sector and then create policy innovations so on to go forward? If they don't have that capability, that's a pretty big weakness. How would you grade the FCC's technical capabilities in this? And if there's room for improvement, how would you suggest that get improved?
Aaron, I feel like that's got you written all over it. I hate to
Boy, what a friend, Brian. Just nominating Aaron to go
I know, I
forward.
just threw under. I'm sorry, but it's just.
That's okay. We do have great engineers. We have great people who, keep apprised of the latest technical innovations. The one thing is that oftentimes the commission is acting actually before the technology is created. So that causes obviously an issue because it's not like we can stand here and say, oh, well, we know exactly how 5G is going to look. We know exactly what we're going to do. We don't have that luxury. We have the luxury, as I said, of putting the resource out there and letting industry figure out how to make it work. And that is probably the best way for the commission to work, because if we do start basing our decisions solely off of technology, that's when the commission starts picking technology winners and losers, and that's where you get into a very, very dangerous area. But oftentimes, I mean, you mentioned a few proceedings where I still cringe when I hear them because, going through the daily grind of trying to figure out exactly what is going to happen going forward, you get to the conclusion where you're like, not only do I know, I can pull in, the great Julie Knapp, I can pull in any engineers or technologists that we have at the commission. At the end of the day, industry still doesn't know where they're going with it. And I think that's the great thing about working at the FCC is that, I'm not going to tell industry what to do. They have to go figure out what is the most marketable and the best use of that spectrum.
I mean, I don't think the problem with those dockets was engineering expertise. I think it was political will more than anything else. And so I think the diagnosis for those dockets and North Point too, at some level, there's a real reluctance to tell people no. And when you really want quick decisions, as long as it's the decision you want, and as soon as it's not the one you want, then you want to go a lot slower. And so I think those dockets are, but I think otherwise, excellence in engineering program, I think, is one way to sort of keep a constant flow of new talent into the agency on engineering. I think adequately funding the IT infrastructure. I like to discuss the tremendous profit that the U.S. government makes on the FCC. No agency is more net positive to the bottom line of the federal government, as I understand it, than the FCC. You would like to think some data, well, Ira, that's fair, okay. That's a whole separate problem.
Someone does this.
Okay, but I think you'd be hard pressed. The data could be, the systems could be upgraded so that they better reflect the technological reality of the industries they regulate, and they could be more effective regulators if that was true. So I think resources on that side would also be true. The labs do a good job with what they have, but there's some issues.
Well, and I'll tell you something that used to happen more 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, especially when some of the first wireless innovation was coming around in spectrum and how do you allocate it and do you do lotteries, do you do auctions? Companies would come in, and I remember doing this with my company, and we'd bring our smartest guy on game theory, and we wouldn't even we'd just be coming in to let him talk to staff about game theory. We weren't pushing an agenda. We weren't saying, here's the answer. Companies spent, because you weren't in as many pitched battles at that moment in time, and you really were looking forward, you could spend more time bringing in incredibly smart, talented people to just almost give a lecture and bring in academics. And I think that that should be highly valued by all agencies, because there's tremendously talented people out there, as we've all listened to today, thanks to your wonderful program. And I know when I was at the agency, I felt like that was such a luxury to be able to have people come in, and yes, they might represent a particular sector of the industry, but it didn't devalue the knowledge that they could impart to me. And that's incredibly valuable.
And it needs to be a great place to be an engineer. It needs to be a great place to be an economist. That there's a great career path, even if you want to leave the agency, and you get to do innovative work. And sometimes that has happened. Some of the really best thinking around the world on how regulation should be done has occurred at the FCC, but you can look at there are times when that's suppressed. You know, we haven't had a paper, an economics paper come out of the FCC now for over 4 years. And it's hard to attract good economists in when that's the case.
So let's talk about around the world, because what's interesting in the world we're living today is we're getting both more internationally interconnected, and yet also there's a lot of pull toward looking at things from more local level. So if you're going to have broadband in a community, that's going to take some local and state leadership to often help make it happen. And yet, if you're going to have 5G, it's going to be international. So this is a more complex world in some ways than we've lived in before. How do you think about the constellation of actors and how authority ends up being shared across a pretty wide swath of institutional actors, from state PUCs to international standards body and everything in between? Brian, you want to take this one first?
I think Brian should take it.
Sitting back. Let's see. I do think that this is a place where legacy regulatory models have remained in place longer than probably functionally useful. Particularly as we've made some progress. I think about franchising, for example. There was a period when franchising was all local, and we managed to move that largely to a state approach. I think that was to the good. It reduced transaction costs and those sorts of things. I think that the evolution of spectrum management to a far more federalized role assisted in the development of national carriers and has helped promote competition here. But there are still many more barriers to break through. The FCC is looking at some of these issues around 5G infrastructure deployment, where this role of states and localities has become, and tribal nations has become a problem, a barrier to people in investing in the ways that perhaps we would like to see. Oftentimes, particularly localities that are cash-starved, using I like to call it the wireless piñata, to bang on wireless carriers who want to deploy in their communities to get exorbitant fees out of them to use their rights of way, for example. So I think we do need to, as technology changes, recalibrate the relationship between different levels of government if we want to remain globally competitive and deliver on the types of services that we want for the American people. The tension on the flip, that is the international side, is no less daunting, in fact, perhaps even more so. Internet governance being probably the number one, but I think 1A is cybersecurity. We have some significant global challenges here. I think Secretary Pritzker, former Secretary Pritzker, recently noted in cybersecurity, it's the only place in our entire economy we rely on private companies to defend themselves against foreign actors. It is a passingly strange phenomenon, but it does underscore the need to think differently about the role of government and indeed multi-stakeholder entities, particularly in issues like cyber, internet, and internet governance, where national boundaries simply don't matter. And we have pushed, the United States, has been a leader in ensuring that this world is connected, I think much to our credit, and the free flow of information is a fundamental American value. But that comes with, unfortunately perhaps for some ceding of responsibility to a global forum for how some of these things are going to work. And it's a tremendous challenge. I think it's going to be a huge challenge for the next administration.
Erin?
I agree with everything Brian said. Basically, I had the pleasure for the first time of going to a plenipotentiary conference at the ITU. And one of the big issues there is internet governance. You quickly figure out that the internet being a global communications system, that we as Americans are like, oh, sure, it's okay for the government to be involved. But you also have to then step back and say, not all governments have the same belief system that the United States has. So you can sit at that conference and you will hear the words freedom of speech thrown out right and left. Well, yes, because China is going to look at you and say that they have freedom of speech. But their freedom of speech then has a whole bunch of exemptions to it. Like, you can say whatever you want as long as you don't criticize the government, as long as you don't bring shame on China, as long as you, and it goes on. So as we look at things like cybersecurity and privacy in the internet realm, you have to remember that there's a very good reason to keep governments out of it, because governments have different end games. So what we consider as keeping our network safe or keeping our information private could also be used by other countries to get information about their people. The other side of the international is the radio conference, so WARC, where I had the pleasure of going to that conference too, and it was sort of the flip side, where you see that, I mean, at ITU events, just like the UN, everybody has a vote, and you want to go to the ITU and you argue for your case, because what you want ultimately is the global harmonization of spectrum, because that would be terrific. It brings down costs. You can take your cell phone and walk into England and you have exactly the same functionality. But what we found is that what happens at places like the ITU is that not everybody, of course, once again, is on the same page as the United States. Some of them are protecting the interests of their incumbents, and we saw that particularly in the 600 megahertz band. So as Brian mentioned, we just finished the incentive auction. We're ready to proceed, but other countries, they're still deploying 4G. They're not ready for 600. They're working on 700, and they're like, wait, our companies have to regain the expense of building out a 4G network, so we're not ready. So we're going to put a halt on that, not let global harmonization of that band be considered. And not only that, we're going to put in a rule where, because our broadcasters are involved, if your next door neighbor country doesn't like the idea of 600 megahertz for wireless, they have the ability to block you. And so what you see then in these conferences
this is at the ITU level.
Yes.
Which in theory would mean that if Canada wanted to block us, they could.
They could. And you saw it happen. Europe was very protective of their broadcasters, so then they blocked Morocco. Morocco then blocked their next door neighbor. Their next door neighbor blocked their next door neighbor. It goes all across the country.
Race to the bottom.
Right. And then you end up with Pakistan blocking India. And so things like that, have not worked out exactly as we had wanted. But the great thing about being the United States of America is that we have the market that we will proceed anyhow.
Mm-hmm. So this is an interesting point that Dale has underscored to me, that our ability to still have the confidence that we have the market that we can proceed outside of what happens to the rest of the world is declining, and that in the case of, say, 5G standards, it's an international body that we need to be really careful about, because we might want to think we've always had this role, but it might actually be Huawei is actually playing at a level that, if we're not careful, they might be more influential. How big a concern is that? Do you want to go first, Kathleen, or we want?
Sure.
Okay.
It is a big concern, because if you look historically at the ITU, the reason it was so successful is that it was mutually assured destruction if you didn't cooperate. How in the world would you get this many countries together on spectrum except that you could blow each other out of the water? And so even through the Cold War, even through Arab Spring, you would find all these countries getting together because of a common desire to ensure that they could use their spectrum in the way they wanted to use their spectrum. We could always take footnotes to many of those decisions because of our geography, and because we're over here away from everyone else. We could say, yeah, we sort of agree to that, but footnote, but we're not going to do it. And we've had that luxury, and that has allowed us to do many things even before other countries were necessarily ready for particular technology. The world is changing now. Technological standards, it's not just the standard setting. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, because of our geographic location, we can do what we want. It's the equipment.
Right.
It's marketing in other countries. It's marketing here. It's consistency when you've got, when you're selling equipment across lines. And I suspect Mark's seen a lot of this, but the world has changed from what it used to be when you were doing the ITU. And we're going to have to adjust and adapt accordingly, I think, because we did kind of push other countries around, just to be honest.
And I can't address the 5G issue specifically, but as I work with different regulators around the world, you know, they're my students, they tend to be. The things I emphasize to them that cuts across this is you want the authority to make a decision to rest with those who have the right incentives. They're held accountable and by suffering the consequence of their decision, and they have the best information. So when you take the issue Brian was talking about, the small municipalities, they can push costs off to other people by kind of holding up the people who are trying to place 5G antennas and such as that. When you look at issues that Aaron was talking about, the countries that want to kind of control how the internet might work, well, they're decreasing their accountability to their citizens. And that's what we also not what we want. So that is what I always think about and look at. You know, what are the consequences to the person making the decision? If they're not bearing the cost of that, if they don't have the good information, I want someone else making it.
So one last point on this, and then I actually want to let the audience get a chance to get involved, so reflecting on the panel here and also the whole day, to the extent people have other thoughts they want to get in. One challenge that really comes to me from what Aaron said about these different country incentives is when we have public policy goals that are going to relate to standards. So take something that Anna and I have thought about, which is FirstNet, and a big challenge is, can you get push-to-talk capability built into a standard at scale so that commercial 4G or 5G phones can actually potentially replace the traditional public safety handheld radios. Other countries may say, well, wait a minute, we have a, I'm going to get this wrong, like Tetra standard that we're really happy with, so this is not a priority for us. And at the small margin, putting this in the standard, we might have to pay just a little bit more money, so we're going to oppose it. How real is that type of threat, and any thoughts on what we do about that?
There's a very good chance that, you know, other countries may oppose it. And, you know, as you raised, that does increase the cost of equipment. Now, what we've seen in other circumstances is that occasionally it's not only the U.S. Maybe it's the U.S., Korea, sometimes it's China. So you do get a larger population who's willing to look into a certain type of technology. It's very rare that I think that it's just the United States. I mean, there's a group of countries that are, you know, tend to have more manufacturers or more providers, more chip makers who will actually try to lead and push the technology. So that, I mean, the more countries and the more pops that you possibly have, the lower the cost comes down of the equipment. So, I mean, the best way, and what happened at the last work, is that it was sort of coalition building. You get as many people to sign on as possible, and as those populations grow, especially if you have countries like China or India or Malaysia with large populations, that lowers your cost.
I also think we just have to, and I believe this is one of the pillars of Kathleen's commissionership, regulatory humility becomes a big deal here, right? There's going to be cases where we're just not going to prevail. And, you know, the government has had OMB Circular 119, I think, that talks about the need of looking to private standard-setting bodies over government standard-setting bodies. Public safety is sort of a weird blend that I think gets you into a world where it becomes much more difficult to win and have a cost-competitive regime. We are blessed by the size of our market and by our geographic reach and by the innovation and entrepreneurship that has typified our development to date. But I think that the threats to that leadership are also growing. And cyber in particular just is really at the top of my mind on that front. But I think the standard-setting body sort of plays into that because the protections are going to need to be global too. And because the nature of the threat and the nature of the market are just so different and interconnected now than it has been.
Let me add one more and let Kathleen take the first stab at this, which is there's a clash sometimes between some of these standard-setting bodies like the Internet Engineering Task Force about to be headed up by Mark Cooper's daughter, Alyssa.
Wow.
That's pretty young.
That's cool.
First woman head of the ITF, chair taking over shortly. And that culture that I believe it's Dave Clark's famous quote, which is, "We don't believe in kings, we believe in rough consensus and running code." Did I get it roughly right, Dave?
What I said, we reject presidents and voting, we believe in rough consensus and running code. It was not meant as an unalloyed compliment.
Very funny.
So the ITF, literally show me your code transparently. Let's see how this would work. The ITU often is less transparent in how its processes work. And so one concern about governance is these international bodies, to what extent are they transparent, and to what extent, as they deal with public policy concerns, whether it's public safety, people with disabilities would be another one, do people even know that that's going on? Because once it gets baked into a standard and it gets produced at scale, it's going to be really hard to then say, oh, we forgot to do this. It's going to be, the answer is going to be wait till the next generation.
Right.
Yep.
Right. I think that we're going to have to face that challenge because the standard setting bodies are I separate them a bit from the ITU, one country, one vote, where we're doing global spectrum allocation. And that's a good thing that they're separated, because the ITU is by its very nature a political animal, but it also is one country, one vote. And unless you build the coalitions that Aaron is talking about, we will lose every time. So the ability to work within that context for the big picture of where you want to head with spectrum is important. The standard setting bodies I put over here are really the people working to make it happen. And you have to let them do what they need to do to come up with the standards that we can all live with. And I will never understand how they come up with them or what it is, but you do have these underlying social goals, and you have to kind of push them. And I think they eventually, I guess what I'd say is, eventually it kind of works itself out because the engineers are incredibly smart. So even though, think about this, even though wireless phones were never designed for location capability, they were not originally designed that way at all, and yet now they do work that way. So we can fix things after the fact, but you really do have to give the right authority and the right.
That's a great example. That example, driven by U.S. policy in substantial part, in the older worlds. My question is, in the newer world, where the U.S. may have left influence,
I know.
Is that optimism warranted? And to make this even more painful, Dave will give me the details, but I think the IETU has actually seen the IETF as a threat, and on some issues around, let's say, internet interconnection, has tried to push the IETF out of the zone and to essentially become more relevant, viewing internet standard setting bodies as a threat to their traditional role. All right, let's go to the audience. Dave, you want to go first on that point? How much are you worried about the ITU as an institutional actor compromising the traditional role of the IETF, which did have much more of the engineers are going to work this out ethos?
Well, you have to focus on what issue it is. The ITU sets standards, and I think the IETF and the ITU, in the context of standard setting, have established some rapprochement. The standards we use for video encoding and things, so we've sort of drawn some lines there. The issue that you brought up about the ITU trying to get into the business of regulating international interconnection is not actually a domain in which the IETF speaks, because it's about standards. And the issue of international interconnection has to do with more operational issues. So tariffs, the possibility of reimposing sort of termination fees on international income. That was, I found, a very distressing, let's take a time machine into the past, but it wasn't invading the IETF's territory because that's not what they do. They set standards. So it was more operational. And they had to be displaced by an argument that basically it didn't need to be regulated at all because the private actors were working it out.
Well, and I think there has historically been this regulatory creep by the ITU, and you have to keep, and as a country, we've continually pushed back on that because the ITU was created for spectrum. It was not created for regulatory mandates, I would argue.
Well, it was originally the International Telegraph Union.
Well, true.
So the answer is it actually is older than Spectrum. Spectrum is one of the, I think, one of the 4 sectors within the ITU,
Good.
which have sort of been rolled up. And so there are different advocates for different histories that try to bring their agenda forward. Right.
And just to invoke Stephen Williams, who I believe at the first conference said, something like he said today, that entrants are regulated because incumbents want it that way. The ITU has also been occasionally called the International Incumbents Union.
It's very funny.
So, all right, we've got lots of people, but we have first to hear from a student. And there are lots of you I can call on. Okay, so I am going to ask Tyler for his question.
The Socratic style.
Exactly, Socratic style.
He needed to be looking down.
You should have crawled.
Okay, so I actually have to say I stepped out for kind of the first time of the panel. So if this question has already been answered, forgive me for this. But I'm kind of curious what your take is. I mean, we were just talking a lot about the ITU and how much of a role it has to play in kind of setting standards for spectrum and things like that. And I was wondering how much kind of regional allocations of spectrum or regional players, for example, the NAFTA bloc, or regions in China, or excuse me, in Asia, like if China has allocated a certain amount of spectrum, how much influence that might have at the ITU, or at the international level, and whether or not the U.S. can influence kind of regional policy and thereby influence international policy. So sorry if we've already talked about that, but that's my
question. No, we have not talked
question.
about that at all. What's the regional variation or experiments that is tolerated within the ITU? Is that a strategy that can
There
work?
are regions within the ITU. For instance, the United States is in CETAL. So that's, North America, South America. Then, and I'm not going to remember all the names of the various regions, but oddly enough, it's like Europe and Africa are part of the same region. And then you have, basically Asia, APT is a separate region. So yes, I mean, the normal process is that before a work and you're going to come out with your proposals, the United States will also make their proposal to their region. So that would be CETAL. And then CETAL, they take a vote amongst the region, and then the region can also go advocate on behalf of that particular policy if the members vote for it. So obviously a position that comes in from CETAL carries more weight than one individual country.
All right, great question. All right, Andy in the back.
You may regret calling on me, Phil. I'm going to criticize the panel here.
Andy, this is the first time we've had a whole Republican panel in the history of
Well,
Silicon
that's
Flatiron.
that's right.
So I'm not,
I've got 3 friends on the panel, and I'm sure if I meet Dr. Dr. Jameson, we'll become friends. But when you have 4 Republicans on a panel, you not surprisingly underestimate the important role the government has in stimulating innovation and competition. And the first part of the panel disturbed me because the notion that government has not played a role, leave aside funding research, a direct role in innovative technology, I think is dead wrong. And I also think that starving government is a huge problem with respect to innovation. So let me frame it as 2 questions. Number 1, if government doesn't contribute meaningfully to technological advancement, do you support abolition of DARPA, NIH, and the research and innovation done by the intelligence communities? And number two, if you think government should get out of the business and we should cut the size of government, have hiring freezes, do you support continuation of the Obama administration's efforts to make government work attractive for technologists by creating a technology core and trying to draw young technologists into government?
So Andy, I have to say, you must have listened to a different panel than I did, because what I heard the panel say was a number of policy innovations like allowing unlicensed spectrum gave rise to a lot of innovation. And the second is, I don't think we talked at all about the role of R&D. So I'm just going to pretend the question you asked is, what's your view at R&D? Which is a really good question. So I'll ask Manel, what's your view on the role of government funding R&D, whether it's DARPA or NSF, with particular application of spectrum, but others recognizing, of course, that the government did, of course, fund the research that led to the internet? Any thoughts on government funding for R&D? You want to start with that, Kathleen?
You've got to have some government funding of R&D. I have no problems with that. My point, I was referring to the role of the FCC and what they do as an administrative agency responsible for a regulatory framework. Government-funded R&D it's part of who and what we are as a country. I don't see that changing. I think it has to be supplemented with private funding too, and we see that, and that's where you get, Apple and Microsoft and Facebook.
Interesting enough, Apple, a lot of that came from Xerox PARC, which was funded by their patent, but Xerox PARC was too either inept, lazy, or stupid to realize the innovations they had. So Steve Jobs literally walked into it, came out with a graphical user interface and the mouse. And for those who want to see the movie version, there's a great movie called The Pirates of Silicon Valley, with both Noah Weil as Steve Jobs and Anthony Michael Hall as Bill Gates.
Yeah. And see, I just want to
Mic drop.
I guess two things. One, I certainly agree with the R&D point. Actually, Chairman Kovacic mentioned this earlier. I do think that the importance of government looking at R&D to policy innovation and structural experimentation, I think, is very important. What I think Kathleen and I were talking about is I don't necessarily think that the FCC lab should be trying to invent the next cell phone. I think those are two very different things. And I just want to put a plug in the technology core. I'm actually a fan of mandatory national service, whether it's through programs like Technology Corps or City Year or other. There's a number of AmeriCorps, a number of great programs out there, so you'll get no fight out of me for those.
And one thing I'll pick up on this, the point that Andy raises, and I talk about this in this paper was referred to, the U.S. Digital Service was a great innovation that came out of the whole failure that was healthcare.gov.
Yep.
That was an example of government failing in a way they couldn't deny it. It was so obviously a failure. And then that led to the U.S. Digital Service asking, why can't we in the government use Amazon Cloud Services or really much more agile development of software as opposed to the traditional waterfall? And that U.S. Digital Service is a great innovation. We have one more student wanting to get right here, right? Yeah.
The question is about LTE-U. Recently, I think for the last year, there has been many tests going about LTE-U, Qualcomm heading all the tests. So how is FCC gonna proceed with the LTE-U? We got the Wi-Fi providers trying to be protective of their spectrum, but at the same time, cellular providers want to grab the free spectrum which is available in the unlicensed band.
Brian, since you keep throwing Aaron to the bus, I want you to go first on that one.
We had this topic in class, in the spectrum class this past summer, so I've actually answered this question for him before. No,
He wasn't paying
don't
attention.
turn me up here. As we talked about it, I think it was unfortunate that the last commission did not move more quickly to permit true innovation in the band. I think Dale and I share this view, and I think that we've seen some progress on this front, and hopefully continued progress will occur so that the commons will continue to be the commons, that as long as you adhere to certain rules of the road, whether it's in a park or in a highway, that you're allowed to participate and in all of the innovation that brings. So,
Although I heard I'll give a gloss from this question, which is there a risk that depending on how things go at the FCC, you're going to see people going to the ITU and in effect trying to hem in or influence FCC decisions? Is that a risk?
I don't necessarily see that happening, but others may be better positioned to answer that than I am.
I don't think so.
I don't think so, but
I mean, that's
So, I mean,
long term, I think there's a threat for things like cyber standards, things like that, where people would bypass.
Right.
But I feel like I'm hoping for now that the things that, and in fact, that was the conversation I think we just had. I think there's the implementation is generally left to our operational stuff tends to be left to each individual administration. So I think it's harder to imagine.
All right. Other questions? We got Dr. Cooper and then Jolie.
I want to offer two observations, and it's really important. So one, this question of international governance and the tension between the 19th century model, the ITU, and the 20th century model, the IETF, and others, is really important because if you look at that arm wrestling, for instance, the Paris Agreement, which is a topic of conversation, governments sign treaties, and there's no way around that. But the Paris Agreement 50 times addresses subnational units and local bodies, so they understand the possibility of a more direct form of democracy. And how this plays out is really important. Yeah. And since Andy was allowed to make a political statement, I'll make one too. The fascinating thing is that we have a couple of oligarchs who really hate that international governance regime. And they would like to go back to a world of big blocks where they can have more influence. And it's really important for people to figure out what kind of model they want for the future, whether they want a multinational model or not. Second observation is...
Mark, was there a question that first
one?
The
question is, how do we avoid, because once you give individual nations authority, you have billions of people who may be cut off. And we certainly don't want that. So how do we actually make it clear that global institutions are what we want as long as they can function in an open and transparent manner?
So I'll add one institution we haven't talked about yet, ICANN, which has been criticized at times for not being transparent in how it operates. Can we achieve the goal of building global institutions that operate with the norms that we believe in? And how do we think about that challenge?
We're going to have to give up more than we're going to want to get that done, I think. Because I think there is going to be pressure on U.S. leadership to rally the rest of the world away from the oligarchs. And that means that we're going to have to surrender a lot of control that we historically have had in a lot of these areas. And that is going to be politically extremely difficult.
Well, when it comes to ICANN, we gave over that power already. And I mean, we now have to cross our fingers and hope that it truly turns into a multi-stakeholder approach. And I mean, a lot of people will argue that we turned it over too soon, that there was a lot to still be decided, and that is true. And you know, you have to hope that the structure that they put in place, which does include governments, does not allow them to, you know, grab the agenda and actually control what the future of the internet will look like.
And I do think winning the world also becomes dramatically harder. Well, A, as the world's main surviving superpower, and also as a result of the Snowden disclosures and et cetera, it's a much harder world to win than it used to be for us. Yeah.
I mean, if Larry Strickling were here post his job and being totally honest, he would say the Snowden disclosures pulled the legs out from under him in negotiating leverage because we couldn't have a high ground at that point.
Yeah. Every country I've worked with, that was an issue.
All right, Jolie.
Good afternoon. Thanks all of you for being here. So I have two questions, but I promise that they're both actually questions, and the second one is short. The first one is about some of the topics we heard in the last panel about continuity on the one hand and innovation on the other hand, and then Chairman Kovacic's point about transitions between administrations. And so my question is, I guess picking up on the continuity versus innovation theme in regulation, do we see a continuity versus disruption theme currently? And if so, how can we better insulate the institutions that directly influence information policy to weather the transitions that Chairman Kovacic was talking about?
Let's do the first. We'll give you the second question in a second. It's such a good question. And I'm going to just add one last wrinkle. One of the issues that's going to come up tomorrow is risk and resilience. Part of the reason we might like continuity in certain regulatory structures is we think it keeps us more resilient and predictable. The more you're changing things, the more you're potentially open to unpredictable things happening. And I guess a defense that one may offer on this Wi-Fi LTE is, oh, we were just really worried about the change. So we didn't want to allow the disruption because it could hurt what we're relying on. That goes against the premises of unlicensed, but that may have been the motivation. How do you think of the moment we're in? There's lots of different ways to think about it. You gave a vision early, Brian, about, well, this is an administration that's not going to be afraid to try new things. Is that how you view it, or do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I do think this administration and the new leadership is more interested in breaking glass than you've seen in a very long time, and that does present an opportunity. I think that in our space, that we see a fair amount that the glass is going to be broken by experienced hands, and so I think you should be less uncertain about that. You know, what does this look like 2 or 3 years ago? I don't know, but when it comes to things like FCC reform and eliminating silos and looking at some of these issues differently, I think we have enforcement, for example, which is something we alluded to but haven't talked about as much. I think you're going to see some real opportunities for change that will be to the better.
And I will add that this continuity is used by the parties that used to be in power and don't want to see things changed. And my team would do the same thing when we lost power and Democrats come in and want to change things. The reality is, though, there is a legal framework, there is a statute there that governs agencies, and the big issue is going to be how flexible is that authority and how much can you revise decisions that were previously made. And so let's just go to the Title I versus Title II for net neutrality. And most people would say Title II was created for common carriers. How many common carriers? How many people in this room work for a common carrier? I do, but I don't think a lot of other people work for a common carrier. The statute's outdated. That requires agility by regulators, and regulators on various issues are going to disagree about how they use that agility, how they make their legal arguments. I'm not worried about the disruption occasioned by that, because the companies that are out there living by this regulatory framework are going to adjust. We always do. We may not like it if our particular business framework, if the thumb is put on it on the scale and we're disadvantaged. We like it if we're advantaged, but that's just the world in which we live.
If I could jump in, go ahead.
Just to take it back more to the FCC, I mean, yes, I mean, whenever you have an administration change, I mean, you have some level of, as you would call it, disruption, because different paths will be taken. But I'll also say there's a flip side to that, in taking net neutrality off the table, because that is obviously a highly political issue where you just have two very entrenched sides. But even in normal rulemaking over the past few years at the commission, you have more continuity if you have 5-0 decisions. And we've been in a world where most of the decisions have been 3-2. They didn't need to be that way. But if parties aren't working together and you start getting those split votes, that's where, when you have an administration change, you have disruption, because the other party is going to come in and they're going to see it in a different way.
Yeah, it's just looking at it, through all the academic research and my experience with other countries, it's not that you want continuity. What you really want is predictability, that you can look at the laws, you can look at the facts, and you can pretty much tell what the regulatory agency will do. We're not in that situation. Because our laws are outdated, it's incoherent. We need a coherence between reality and the laws. That has to be fixed. And then also, we need better fact-based decision-making within the agencies, so that when people are saying, okay, here's a decision that's coming, they don't pay as much attention to the political winds as they do the evidence. I think that's something we have to work on here as well.
And continuity is a personnel issue as much as anything else, and all these agencies are built with 90% plus the personnel who are continual as professional staff, and that helps to bridge some of that gap as well. But the macro point, which I think Kathleen and Mark just alluded to, is it cannot be that how broadband is regulated whether or not it's a Title I, Title II service just depends on how the election turns out. There should be an underlying scientific answer to that question, and or the Congress should speak to end the question forever, because you can't run 1/5 of the economy on something that changes regulatory treatment every time we have an election.
Right. But I will tell you this, if you look at the last panel, we were talking about antitrust law and mergers. The FCC, because it does have this broad public interest analysis associated with mergers, whoever is in charge when a merger comes in front of it, if it hasn't been stopped by the Department of Justice, then the FCC, depending on who's in charge, gets to decide what voluntary concessions will be derived. And those voluntary concessions are public policy goals that a particular commission wants to pursue, and they don't pursue them through rulemaking, they pursue them through a deal, and they put them on a particular company. And they may be very noble public policy goals, but it's not based on a jurisdictional authority, it's not based on an analysis, and it'll never be reviewed in any courts. Those are...
And that actually, as Brian said, we didn't get to talk about that as much as, but the institutional pathologies of the FCC, that would be the one that I would be the most pained by, with the particular example of the XM serious interference dispute that was never handled as an enforcement matter based on facts and law. It was a negotiated conclusion of a so-called enforcement matter in the context of the merger commitment. And the problem the agency has had is that's not a way to run a railroad.
Correct.
And hopefully that will improve. All right, Jolie, your final before we go to break. What's your second short question?
Okay, so this is a question for us to talk about at break, maybe inspired by Brian when you mentioned cyber, and then also by our discussion about international standards and agreement. How do we reach international agreement on cybersecurity standards when some of the players involved in cyber attacks are, in fact, nation states?
And that was your short, easy question?
That's what I was thinking.
It was shorter than the first one, right?
That goes back to my point that that's why governments maybe shouldn't be involved, and you go to multi-stakeholder industry groups.
No, it's a pretty powerful, painful question to think about.
And it can't just be governments, right?
And
Yes.
and I think that part of the challenge, I think this was Mark Cooper's oligarch point, is we have a tradition of norms around transparency and the rule of law about how we do things. If other countries don't have that, trying to come up with international frameworks is not easy to do, and this world is international with data flows. So I'm really glad we can say that the Risk and Resilience panel will talk about cybersecurity tomorrow. We really hope you come back for it. Let me thank this wonderful panel for a great discussion. Invite people to reception, and if you are a professional, please seek out our students. They will be thrilled to discuss this topic and others with you. Thanks, everyone.